Hey, welcome to Life in the Leadership Lane. I'm your host, Bruce Waller, where I get to talk to leaders that are making a difference in the workplace and in our communities. What did they do to get started and what are they doing to stay there? And here we are, season 4. Can you believe it? And I have another special guest. Today, we're getting to hear from Mike Pierce. Mike Pierce is he works for Lockton Companies, and he's involved in their health and welfare practice. And Mike, I'm so excited to have you on the show. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I appreciate you having me today.
Mike is also the 2023 president for DallasHR. And hey, I was actually thinking about, before I got you on, I was thinking, Mike was the president-elect under Callie Miller, who
That's
I've
right.
had on the show.
Sure.
And you have also Lauren Truelove coming up behind you. So now all of a sudden I've got the trifecta here now that I have you on the show.
I'm glad to hear that. And you also are showing that I am like surrounded by some amazing talent. So it's always nice to really kind of come behind somebody who's phenomenal like Callie. And then I've always got LT right behind me. So if I mess things up, I know she can always make it right. So I'm happy to have that.
I love it. Callie and LT. That is fantastic. I love that. Hey, listen, I'm glad to have you on the show. And we're gonna talk Dallas HR. We're gonna talk leadership. But to kind of kick things off, for those who don't know Lockton, I would love for you to share, like, who is Lockton and how do you serve your customers?
So Lockton, we at the highest level are an international commercial insurance broker. And like a lot of other commercial insurance brokers out there, we have a practice that's dedicated to helping employers with really anything around their people solutions. Specifically, my domain of expertise is really health and welfare plans, those employee benefits. So things like medical, dental, vision, life, disability, sometimes retirement plans. That's really where I spend the bulk of my time. But I'm surrounded by a lot of colleagues that help employers out with really anything regarding their human capital strategy and just their overall operations within the organization. But my domain, and really where I kind of grew up and spent most of my time, was really kind of dealing with the medical, the dental, the vision, the life, the disability, those bulk lines of coverages that really constitute and kind of make up an employee benefits package.
Fantastic. I appreciate you sharing that. And I want to know, like, I want to hear, like, how did you get to that point? I would love to hear the Mike Pierce story.
Yeah. So I grew up in North Texas and grew up in a suburb of Dallas-Fort Worth area, a city by the name of Arlington. About the age of 18, 19, like a lot of us, finished up high school and found myself at the University of Texas at Austin, where I got my bachelor's degree in liberal arts. Also met my beautiful wife and bride-to-be, Lacey, so that was always a plus. So I guess you could say, if anything, I came away with her degree secondary, right? After that, Lacey and I came back up here to Dallas. We lived here for a small window, and then found ourselves in New York City. And we were up there for, I guess, somewhere around 7 to 10 years, somewhere around there, kind of in and out of New York. After that, we decided to start a family and said, hey, you know what? Raising a family in New York City, while it would be a fun adventure, just wasn't really something that we wanted to embark on. So we decided to move back to North Texas and found ourselves in Dallas. During that time, whenever we came back to Dallas, I was working in the health and welfare in the employee benefit space. And I was more on the vendor side, sometimes what we refer to as a point solution in my space.
Okay.
And a point solution, that is typically a vendor that'll come in and work with employers. And they'll typically provide a very narrow service, but be really deep experts on it. And so I was working for this point solution, and I said, you know what, I really want to get to the broker and the consultant side. And so whenever we made the move from New York to Dallas, I was lucky enough to end up making the move into the brokerage and consultant space. And lo and behold, several years later, here I am at Lockton. And, also during that time, started doing a lot of stuff with DallasHR. And before I knew it, looked up and was president. So it's been pretty exciting.
Before you looked up, you were president. That's a great story. We have a lot of common threads. Because that's kind of how I experienced my being president. I joined the organization that I looked up and I was president. Interesting. But meeting Lacey in college at the University of Texas, I met my wife in college at the University of Central Oklahoma. And so we both met our wives in college. I may have known that. I didn't remember that. So that's fantastic. But you found home in Dallas. You've done a great work here. And I love how you talked about going from a point solution to the broker consulting side. I didn't know that. And so here you are doing that. Well, I do like to ask my guests around the question of purpose. And I
Mhm.
always talk about finding your lane. I wrote the book Find Your Lane. It's really about your calling, but I do want to know, like, now that you've like gotten to where you are today,
Mhm.
was there like a point in your career where you're like, you know what, I love what I do?
I think if I'm really honest with myself, I think my career and probably where I'm at today was probably a lot of chance encounters, and a lot of lucky breaks, and it all kind of culminated into where I'm at today. I don't know that 10 or 15 years ago I necessarily charted this out and said, "Here's where I want to get." But it's all gone really well, and I'm definitely grateful for that all kind of coming together. To answer your question though, back to your root question, I think having that purpose and having a little bit more definitive, like, why am I doing this? What am I doing this for? Has definitely, for me, crystallized probably in the last couple of years.
Mm,
I think as my son gets older, I'm
mm,
much more conscious about what tone I'm setting for him, what he's seeing me do, what he's seeing me do out in the community, what he's seeing me doing professionally, what he's seeing me do in my downtime, right? So I'm much more conscious about that because you start to think like, hey, how's that next generation looking up to you? And then I think in addition to that, now that I've kind of ascended into various leadership roles, there's a lot of questions of why am I doing what I'm doing? Because when you're leading a lot of people and there's just a lot more on the line, you want to make sure that you've got some North Star, some guiding principles that are telling you why you're doing what you're doing. I mean, I think you owe it to the folks that are in the organizations that you're leading. And so I've definitely had a lot more clarity for me as an individual, why I do what I do and how I go about doing that, probably in the last couple of years. But there was never that moment earlier in my career where I said, hey, this is really why I'm doing it. But it's definitely now that my child's a little bit older, my son, now that I'm kind of in a little bit more leadership roles and things like that, it's definitely kind of clarified for me.
well, and I know that if you would ask me when I was in my mid-30s, I wouldn't probably been able to answer that question. But
Yeah.
then I hit my 40s, and all of a sudden I start looking back, and it starts getting more clear. So I can see what you're talking about is as you get older, as your children get older, you just like you get more clarity around that.
Yeah.
Talk about. I always like to ask about mentors. Talk about maybe a mentor or two that's helped you get to where you are today, and what was a trade or what was something about that mentor that helped you?
I've been really fortunate. I've had mentors on a lot of walks of life,
Mm,
um, whether it be here at Lockton, whether it be within Dallas HR, whether it be at church, just in the community and civic side. Um, I've been really fortunate just to have some really great people come into my life. Two that I definitely have to call out, I would say, is, here at Lockton, I've been very fortunate to be mentored and really shown the business through our CEO, here, a gentleman by the name of Bruce Samus. Bruce really took me under his wing um, early on in my career and gave me a lot of confidence and also gave me a lot of technical insight in showing me how to work the business, how to serve clients, how to make decisions when I'm doing stuff day to day to make sure my clients go first and they get what they need. And it's really been, it's been just a phenomenal relationship under him. Someone else that I would call out is probably more on the Dallas HR side, and someone who just really I feel like changed the trajectory of things for me. I would say Lynn Stewart, and Lynn, who we just recognized as Lifetime Achievement Award winner here just recently at Dallas HR during our HR gala. She was someone that when I moved to Dallas, um, one of the first people I stumbled into and, was like, hey, I'm trying to figure out Dallas. I'm trying to figure out what I want to do. And, before I walk out of that coffee, Lynn's got an entire map of all the people I need to know, all the places I need to go, and just really kind of set me on a really wonderful trajectory. And I'm grateful for that. And she's just been a friend and a cheerleader in a really big way for me ever since that interaction. But, with that said, I mean, I've still met and meet on a daily basis so many people that influence me. I mean, like yourself, I mean, you've been instrumental in giving me guidance and showing me like this is the way to interact with people. These are the things that we do. This is how to really be a servant leader. I think of your brother, Mark. He's also been a really great mentor to me and has really shown me a lot of ways. to live my life. You know, Mark is somebody who I think is a phenomenal businessman, but I also really cherish and see all the things that Mark has done on the family front, which I aspire to. So, you know, I think you just have to look for those mentors in everyday life and take the little tidbits that you can. It's not always going to be a super structured relationship where they're going to have an agenda and say, here are the 3 things I'm going to teach you today. And so I think just being mindful of that and always kind of looking for those mentorship moments, that's really how you can kind of get the most out of some of that stuff.
Yeah, I love that. As a matter of fact, Lynn Stewart, you talked earlier, you said she's a cheerleader. She literally was a cheerleader at Texas Tech, but no, phenomenal ambassador, lifetime achievement recipient at the gala. And I share a story about that one of the first times I met Lynn. And I remember she was the ambassador director. So her job was to get ambassadors at each table so everyone would feel welcomed, and they had they were all getting to know each other at the tables. And I remember she said, hey, I want you, and I was on another committee at the time. She said, I want all these ambassadors to meet for lunch. We're going to meet on Wednesday in the boardroom. Just come. And so I went to that meeting, and Mike, it was in the old DallasHR boardroom. There were 20 seats around the table, and there were 40 people there.
Yeah.
And it was packed. It was packed. And she brought lunch in for everyone. And next meeting, there was an ambassador at every table. Like, she showed the way. She was phenomenal. So
Sure.
absolutely. That's great. I love when guests talk about mentors, because I think it gives us a chance to kind of reflect on what you said about Mark. And you said, not just in the workplace, but how do I live our lives, right? And so I love that, and I appreciate you sharing that. Hey, let's talk leadership here. I always like to ask my guests, here you are, you're in this leadership role at Dallas HR, the 3rd largest chapter in the country, and a big responsibility. But I like to ask, if someone said, hey, Mike, what's leadership to you? How would you respond to that?
It's funny that you asked that question because, and I don't know how much of this you know, but right now I'm going through being a part of Dallas HR and being the president of it. One of the benefits is you actually get to be a part of Texas SHRM. And Texas SHRM, as you know, put together a leadership development program. And so I've recently been doing some of that. We were actually defining exactly that and talking about the different styles of leader. But to me personally, I think what leadership means, technically, I think what it really means, obviously, is to lead a group of folks, try to set the vision, try to set the strategy, and making sure that you're actually moving towards the right direction, that you're going from A to B. And how are you doing that? Trying to get a group of people to go and work together to get from A to B, and making sure you're holding people accountable and things are moving in the right direction. With that said, though, and this kind of goes back to the Texas SHRM leadership development, one of the most fascinating things, I think, for me as an individual and as a leader in the last couple of months, I think, as I've kind of taken on the Dallas HR role, and taken on more leadership at Lockton, is having to elevate my leadership style from jumping in and saying, hey guys, I'm the strongest doer. We need to work on this project, or we need to get this done. So I'm going to jump in and get it done. And you guys can watch me work and kind of replicate it. And I'm going to show you how I'm a great leader because I'm just such a strong doer. To where, when you're leading an organization as big and as robust as Dallas HR, you can't do that anymore. If I try to jump in on every single project and said, let me touch it, let me show you how great of a doer I am, I would exhaust myself. I just wouldn't have the capacity. There's 168 hours in a week, and it's like, there's just no way that I could physically do that. Right. And so I've really had to elevate my leadership style to being one that is now setting vision, setting strategy, encouraging people to go and do things, following up with people, holding them accountable, because I just don't have the man hours or the capacity to necessarily be the doer on all that stuff. And so it's been a really fascinating transition for me. And I think it's been very noticeable probably since the turn of the year. So call it, the last 60 to 90 days. That has been a really big shift for me. And I'm still trying to figure out how to do it on a daily basis, because daily I'm fighting this urge. I'll see something within Dallas HR, oh, we're going to put on this event, or we're going to do that. And my natural instinct is to jump in, build an Excel sheet, and be like, all right, here's all the people that we're going to invite to speak, and here's how we're going to set the whole thing up. And then I realized, like, wait a minute, I need to not do that. I need to look around the room and say, okay, who wants to run with this? Who's going to take the ball and run with it? Why don't you report back to us in 30 days what you come up with? And if you're having any headwinds or anything like that, let's discuss them as a group and see what we can do to help remove those headwinds for you, remove those obstacles. So that's been a big shift for me. I kind of meandered a little bit to your original question, but you asked what is leadership. But for me, I don't know if there's like a specific answer. But for me personally, that's kind of been the journey that leadership has taken for me, just in terms of what it is and what it looks like.
I love that. I appreciate you sharing that. I wrote down doer, and I'm sitting here thinking, I want to dive into that a little bit more, because there are people listening to the podcast right now that are thinking, that's me. I'm a doer. Like, I need to get it done. I want people around me. I want them to help, but they're not available. I just need to do it. Let's talk about that for a second. Like, I know you said, hey, that's been challenging. You haven't figured this out yet, but
Yeah.
what are maybe a couple of things that you've kind of like thought about? Like, oh, I need to be thinking about this. Like, as you were sharing that,
Yeah.
I feel like I've kind of been similar. I was that early on, and that was when I would start thinking about patience, right? It had to be more like
Definitely.
patient, like, hey, I want to get it done, but yet, maybe, okay, maybe we just need to take our time through this. What are your thoughts around that? What are a couple of things that you might share for some of the listeners?
I think a few things, and I don't have like a prescriptive list, so I don't like can't say
Maybe
these
we're gonna
five
make a
things.
play. Wait, maybe we'll
But
make a playbook here.
I like it. I like it. We'll just see where
Mike.
it takes us. No, a few things, a few lessons that I've learned even in a short time, just I think approaching leadership in that way is one of the first ones, I think, and this was a big one for me, kind of the number one, was I've got to stay organized if I'm going to lead that way. And so what I
Mm,
mean by that is when I'm sitting in a Dallas HR operations board meeting, board of trustees meeting, or just interfacing with folks, and I say to them, hey, will you go and run this project for me? um, I have to stay organized, meaning that I have to make sure that I set some sort of system for myself to ask them, how are things going 30 days from now, right? I can't just say, will you take this and hope that miraculously 6 months from now, like they have the event and it goes off without, any glitches whatsoever. It's like, I've got to help them along that process and ask them like every 30 days on a regular cadence, how are things going? Is there anywhere you need help? Is there anywhere that we can like jump in and brainstorm? Is everything going great? And it's okay if they say, hey, everything's going great. I really don't need you. That's okay. I can kind of walk away and say, all right, I'll come back in 30 more days. But they might say, hey, I'm really dealing with X, Y, and Z. Could you help me just think it through? And, I kind of owe it to them to do that. So again, I think the number one thing is kind of staying organized, having that regular cadence and just that cycle of accountability, if you will. I think the other thing that I've learned is there's also an element of trying to the best of your ability, trying to measure someone up and understanding their strengths,
mm,
and then trying to get them into projects, I think that really emphasize those strengths, right? As opposed to putting them in a project where it's like, hey, you're really weak in this area, and I'm going to put a project, give you a project that highlights your weaknesses. Go the other way, right? I'm going to give you a project that really taps into your strengths. And I think by doing that, you're just setting people up for success. And I realize that you can't always do that, right? Sometimes you just got to get a project done and you got to use who you got to use. But I think if you can be a little more conscious about that, I've tried to be, I think you can have a little bit more success. And then, another big thing is for me as an individual, and I'd be curious, and I imagine others grapple with this too, is trying to suppress and hold back my own impulses. And so what I mean by that is when I'm having those accountability and those check-ins or a project comes up, sometimes my natural desire might be to jump in and take the bull by the horns and run with it, or to just like spout out like, well, here are 3 ways that you can do it. And I have to like hold back that impulse, and I have to really hold my tongue, because I'm not there to be the smartest guy in the room. I'm there to help like coach them and help them bring the solution about and really be their collaborator. And so I've had to learn that. I think that patience and just kind of going through that process. And that's I think as I get older, it's maybe a little easier to do, but not something that I was probably really strong on, earlier in my career. But those are three things that kind of
yeah.
come to mind as you talk about like what are specific tactics to take and run with.
Yeah, I love that. I love number one. We talked about, you said, you didn't say we or the team. You said, I need to stay organized. And I love that, because you're basically saying, hey, first of all, I'm going to take accountability for this for the entire project, right? I'm going to
Mhm.
stay organized. And then number two, and so you could, have your check-ins, create that cadence that I love that. And then you said number two, know your strength, like know others' strengths, like try to figure out a way to measure that. And sometimes you can't, like you just said, sometimes that you have to go through the process before you can understand somebody's strengths,
Mhm.
right? So therefore, when you go through that process, you may need to like, okay, you know what? I just need to work through this, see how this goes. We might learn through failure, but during that time, you may see opportunities to say, hey, you know what? I see this person needs someone else here, and I'm going to just
Mhm.
put someone else with them. And then lastly, I love what I'll tell you, this is me, and I'm sure there's probably some listeners holding back impulses like, hey,
Mhm.
it's not getting done. I just got to go do it.
Right.
Right. And by the way, if you're listening to the show right now, write those down, and share your thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts on that as we talk about going from that doer, right, to that leader.
Mhm.
Just some general things on, because and especially think about even there's a lot of in our audience, there's a lot of departments of one,
Mhm.
right? So they don't have five people to say, hey, okay, we're going to delegate this project to. So they have to really be strategic around that as well. Yeah, I love that. Hey, I did want to ask you, being in the on the benefits side, and then being the president of this
Mhm.
large organization, what are maybe some topics that you have, I don't know, maybe you've seen in the last 6 months or so that seem to resonate right now? Any thoughts around that?
I feel like when you're president, all you do is like just take in all this data and see these things and the trends. But
Right.
it's really cool. I mean, you do kind of develop this sixth sense because you're going to all these luncheons, and I mean, you've of course been there. It's like you're literally hearing speakers like on a daily basis and just taking in all this content, so you can't help but be like, okay, I think I see how the world is working right now. Okay, so to your root question. Um, I think the big ones right now are still figuring out attraction and retention.
Yep.
How do we attract employees? And then how do we get them to stay once they're here?
Mm,
I think another really big one is employee engagement and trying to solve that riddle. There's kind of this premise like an engaged employee is a happy employee. A happy employee will be more productive and stay with me longer, but it's really fuzzy on how do we actually define an engaged employee and how do we measure that, right? And how do we work towards that? And so I think there's an opportunity to still kind of to fine tune some of that. Those are the big ones. I personally believe that I'm in my late 30s, soon to be 40, and I personally think that for the rest of my career, the issue of trying to attract and retain talent is going to become more and more of a pressing issue because
mm,
if you surely look at the macroeconomic or the macro indicators, right? Like we just don't have enough people to fill all the jobs. And so you've got to figure that out, that equation out as an employer. And so I think HR is going to be working really hard towards that. So that's a big one. And then I think another, something that I genuinely hope that we can solve, and just from an empathetic standpoint, is also like HR folks and the HR community right now is just also really burnt out.
mm.
The last couple of years, I mean, the administrative function, HR, some people in finance, some people in operations, I mean, they just took a really heavy toll with everything going on around the pandemic, right? And that and the combination of a lot of other issues, I think has just really led to a lot of burnout. And so, I genuinely hope that we solve for that. But I think that's another trend that we're kind of seeing there on the horizon. So those are just a couple of
Yeah.
things that I see just kind of on a regular basis.
No, I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I remember when I started attending Dallas HR, 20 years ago, and I remember hearing the war on talent.
Hmm.
And because you said, hey, even with talent attraction, recruiting and attraction, that's still going to be a challenge. And it's interesting because it's a different kind of challenge today,
Hmm.
especially when you have remote work, you have more options. But it was just interesting how that was the top, that was like what everybody talked about. And then here
Hmm.
we are today. people are talking about that. And of course, there's a lot more. Mental health, I think, is one of the big ones that we're
Yeah.
continuing to hear, and having that sense of belonging. But all of that goes back to and engagement was another
Hmm.
one that was talked about. Everybody's trying to figure that one out, right?
Hmm.
And I think you're right on. But the thing about it is, it's like what you just said. As your president, when you attend these and get involved in local chapters, you get to hear from a lot of different speakers. You get to hear all these different perspectives, and
Yeah.
and it's really helping. One thing that I noticed that you posted on LinkedIn, though, I was going to ask you about this because I hadn't really talked about this on the show, and you posted I think it was like it might have been a survey or a question on LinkedIn that said you were talking with an HR leader around combating counter offers.
Hmm.
And you were talking about their talent acquisition team had started performing resignation coaching.
Sure.
And I was like, I want to hear Mike talk a little bit about that. I hadn't really had a conversation around that. Talk a little bit about that and what you learned from that, from posting that.
So I in a couple of weeks, and soon I'll be moderating a panel for a local chamber of commerce where we talk about talent acquisition. So, in preparation for that, just trying to start to get my
Okay.
ducks in a row and kind of seeing what's going on out there in the field of attraction, or the talent attraction side of the equation. And I was talking to an HR leader, and what they disclosed to me was one of the issues that they have. They're in a very hyper competitive industry, and they would send out an offer of employment, and sometimes people would accept it, and then they would go in to resign, and then lo and behold, they would get a counter offer and come back and say, hey, I was just joking, I really don't want to come work for you after all. And so what the opportunity for resignation coaching was, is that talent acquisition professional or HR professional, right, if it's a smaller HR department, would essentially give that candidate an idea of what their employer might say when they walk in and have that conversation. So, for example, they're going to walk in and say, hey, Bruce, I want to give you my notice, my 2-week notice. Bruce might say, you know what? I'm really disappointed to hear that. What if I gave you this? What if I gave you that? And just really preparing that candidate to think through that and just be prepared for that. I think when we go in and we resign, right, it's a pretty emotional experience for a lot of
Mhm.
people.
Right.
And so I think by having just the candidate think about it, role playing, rehearsing that conversation in their head, there's a certain amount of I think, what would the word be? I suppose thicker skin that they would have in that conversation, right? When they go in to give their resignation. And so by doing that, lo and behold, by going through and helping people kind of think through that and be prepared for that, they dropped the amount of people that were rescinding offers, right? So people would accept offers and were actually showing up on day one. And so for that HR team, for that group, that was actually a huge tactic that wound up leading to a lot less people rescinding offers after they had been accepted.
Hmm.
So I thought it was a really interesting. I thought it was a really interesting tactic that people could use, kind of in that talent attraction, talent acquisition side. To your question, though, I thought it was fascinating. So I posted online, "Hey, here's this idea of resignation coaching. Is anybody actually using it? Yes, maybe, or no." And what I thought was fascinating, to go back to your question of like, what did I learn from that poll? Um, there was one company where the talent acquisition leader at the company said, sometimes we sometimes use this, we sometimes don't. The CHRO at that same company said, no, we never use this. And so I thought it was just funny to see that, because
Right.
it just kind of showed that disconnect, in terms of interdepartment. So that was kind of a funny little thing that I picked up on. But it was an interesting little tactic. It's one of those things, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about just a moment ago. When you're one of the cool things about being president of a SHRM chapter and just being, so involved in the community, is the HR community, is you pick up on these little tactics, you have these little conversations. I mean, sometimes you have 10 of them a day, right? And so you pick up on all these little things, these best practices. And I always find it a lot of fun to kind of go back and share those. And I mean, LinkedIn is such a great vehicle for that,
Right.
to kind of share these ideas back with the community and say, hey, who's doing this and who's not? I think on that one in particular, I think it was overwhelming, like 80% or 90% were like, no, we're not doing this.
Yeah.
And only a few were really doing it. So it was just interesting to kind of see the conversation that got started from that.
Well, and it'd be interesting too. I mean, you never know if it might influence someone to start thinking about, hey, we might want to do this, right? We might want to have a discussion with our business unit leaders or people managers. What's something you learned, like you didn't think about? Now you've become the Dallas HR president.
Sure.
Of course, you were elected for a year, so you got to watch a great leader in front of you, and Callie Miller,
Sure.
and you got to kind of see how that goes. But now that you're in that role, like anything that kind of surprised you now that you've been in the role for, Q1?
I mean, I think for me as an individual, I guess a few things. Just for me as an individual, seeing the chapter itself, it's been humbling how big the chapter is and how many events we put on and just how many
Mm,
moving parts there are.
mm,
I mean, as of today, we're what, a little over 1,800 members, 130 volunteers, a staff of 7, 30 people on the ops board, what, 10 or so on the board of trustees. You just realize it's like, gosh, there's just so many people. We put on over 100 events a year. You realize it's such a big entity. And it's kind of like it's a little humbling, like, okay, I just gotta,
mm.
hang on for the ride. It kind of feels like you're on a bus and you like jumped on the top of it and you're just like, hang on, like don't let go. So it's definitely been humbling. And I think I think I'm all those that have come before me, I am much more appreciative of, I think, and
Mhm.
empathetic because I'm like, wow, that really is a big role. You realize real quick, like you're like, okay, there's no way I can touch everything in this
Yeah.
organization. Maybe here's 1 or 2 areas where I can make an impact and change things. And so you kind of double or triple down on those things, and the rest of it you just kind of let roll. So that's been a big eye opener for me. I think the other thing that's been a big eye opener for me, I think, is just the size of the HR community and how many parts there are, and just almost a deeper appreciation for HR in general. I mean,
Mm,
I've been in this space for almost a decade, and I've always appreciated, and I've always been a technician of my space, which is really kind of the employee benefits and looking at the medical and making sure we have a right network and going out and doing RFPs and, trying to make sure we've got bin admin set up and paperwork's done correctly between the employer and the carrier, like all that little stuff. I mean, that, I've been so siloed and so kind of singularly focused on that for so long. And so now just getting this macro perspective of the HR function and HR community, it's definitely given me a much deeper appreciation for what HR is and what it can do. I mean, it ultimately is, if we're successful in HR, I mean, we're ultimately helping people enrich their lives through work. And I don't think there's
yeah.
any more of a noble calling than that. And so for me, that's just been a very, I think, sobering and just eye-opening perspective that I don't think I necessarily had until I ascended to this level. So yeah, I mean, I would say it's definitely changed my perspective, and hopefully it's made me a lot more empathetic, I think, and just appreciative of the space in general.
Yeah, I love that. That is fantastic. Let me ask this, Mike. Like, what drives you? I mean, you're a pretty driven leader.
I think lately it's probably been 7 cups of coffee a day. Is kind of what it feels like sometimes. No, it's one of those things, Bruce. I think I'm at a stage of life, and I feel like I've been moderately successful and things have kind of gone my way. I feel like now I'm kind of at this point where I really just want to help people. I really want to help the community and organizations and try to leave it better than I found it. I don't think I ever realized how fulfilling serving others
Mm,
is, or how fulfilling it is to help just those in the community and those in my profession. And that's really, that's really what drives me on a day in, day out basis now. I have so much fun just working with 130 volunteers, the staff, and just like trying to achieve goals now for the organization. That's really kind of what gets me going every day. And also, I mean, equally, I mean, not to belittle it, I do a lot at Lockton too, right? And I've had a good time over here as well. And so just being able to serve my clients and just being able to help propel them in their businesses has really been phenomenal for me. It has been eye-opening. I think the pace that I'm running at this year in 23, I can see why you're president 1 year and not president for 2 or 3. Thankfully, I've got a very accommodating wife and a very supportive, family. So they're letting me do all this, but I can definitely see where I could do it for 1 year. But beyond that, I might have to pull back just a little bit next year and slow down. So we'll see.
Yeah. Well, you've done a nice job, and I'm excited to see what 2023 shapes out to be. You've got a great team. I mentioned earlier, you got Callie as your past. You got LT coming up behind you. You got an incredible board, and I'm excited. Hey, for those listening, maybe they're in the Dallas area and they don't know Dallas HR, or they do know Dallas HR, or maybe they're in another area where there's
Mhm.
another local SHRM chapter.
Yeah.
Share just maybe one or two things that you would like encourage someone to get involved. Like what's one or two things that they are going to get out of just being part of a local SHRM community? Any thoughts?
Yeah. 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 So you know what? I'm gonna expand on your question if that's okay.
Yeah.
And I'm actually gonna say, if I'm somebody who's never been involved in SHRM, what do I even do? Right? How do I
Hmm.
even jump in?
Hmm.
Because I get that question a lot, right? I get a lot of folks that I meet out and about, and they say, "Hey, you know what? I'm an HR department of one. I've been in HR for 25 years. I just got my degree and I'm just entering HR. How do I get involved? Like, how do I even start?" To your point, I mean, there's a number of SHRM chapters around the country, obviously, all over the place, of all shapes and sizes. I would say, the two things that I would do if I were going to just jump in is, number one, join the chapter, right? Because typically to join the chapter, it's a nominal amount of money. It's not a lot in the grand scheme of things. And that really does go pretty far for the chapter in terms of helping to support it financially and just do all the things that they do. And then number two, I'd really try to make an effort to say, you know what, I am going to attend at least one event every quarter,
Mm.
right? I think saying out of the gate, I'm going to attend every month or I'm going to go weekly is just unrealistic. Because if you haven't really built that muscle or that cadence, it can be a little intimidating. It can be a little hard to do that. But just showing up once a quarter, I think, is something simple and relatively attainable for a lot of people. To your original question, what are they going to get out of it? I mean, there's so much that you can get out of it. I mean, I think one of the big things is that a lot of times you're getting lifelong friends. You're really building deep relationships, professional relationships
Yeah.
that transcribe profession and become personal, or, vice versa or whatever. But I mean, you just get to meet people. And equally, I think what's so valuable about meeting people is HR can be a very isolating function, right? Because a lot of times in a lot of organizations, people just in general don't say, "Hey, I want to go hang out with HR and take them to lunch today," or "I want to go like meet HR at the water cooler and have some gossip with them," right? That doesn't really happen, or at least it shouldn't be in most cases, the gossip at the water cooler, at least, right, with HR. So a lot of times for individuals who are getting involved in that SHRM chapter, you're building relationships with peers that can ultimately be your sounding board and essentially your tribe that you can talk to. So I think that's the first thing that you're going to get out of it. And the second thing, some of the questions that you were asking earlier, is I think it's also going to give you a sense of what's going on in the space and what are some
Mhm.
trends and what are some things taking place. And to me, I mean, that can be invaluable, right? That helps you put into context so many things that you're dealing with. And also that gives you so much power of information that you can all of a sudden then take, share with your executives at your company, use whenever you're like doing your daily tactics and just knowing what's going on in the space. And I mean, that can just really help you level up your game. So those are some basic things
Yeah.
that I would do to get involved in a chapter. And then I think some of the benefits you're actually going to get out of a chapter.
That's some great feedback. I think there's somebody listening right now, Mike,
Hmm.
that said, I needed to hear that. I'm going to reach out. It's time for me to get involved, and it's going to change the trajectory of your career. And so I appreciate you sharing that. This is good stuff. Hey, I do want to ask, I want to ask you one last question before we get into it's time to accelerate. I always like to ask my guests if they've ever been given any advice. It was so good. You just find yourself sharing that with others.
I probably go back to some of the mentors that you asked and that we talked about earlier, and just folks, you know, and this probably has more to do with the Lockton side than the Dallas HR side, but one of the biggest things that I've just learned professionally, and actually now I think about it, it probably has parallels to Dallas HR too, is to just put your clients and your customers first and
Mm,
do whatever is right by them. And the rest of everything else will figure itself out. And when you hear that early on in your career, you're like, no, 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 I want immediacy. I want it now. I want to get to it. And you realize after you can kind of sit back and say, look back on 10 years and be like, no, that's actually right. Like if I put others first, the people that I'm serving, typically everything else will kind of, find its way to me, and it works out okay. So that's probably the biggest piece of advice that I was ever given that has really like ring true, and that I find myself kind of, telling the younger folks that I come across sometimes.
I love that because you said earlier, that's one thing that really gives you fulfillment too, is that you find yourself just wanting to help people,
Mhm.
and so when you put people first, it just gives you like, there's just so much to that. And so that's great advice. I appreciate that so much. Hey, I told you the time was going to fly, and it has flown by. We're going to shift to it's time to accelerate. I'm going to ask you just a few fun questions. First question is, would you rather read a book or listen to a podcast or listen to
Mm.
an audible?
Man, that's a tough one. It totally depends on the mood, because I walk the dog first thing in the morning, and when I'm walking the dog, it's podcast. But then when I go home at nighttime and I get a couple minutes to myself, it's a book.
Mm,
So it kind of goes back and forth
okay.
throughout the course of the day. It really depends on kind of what I'm doing in the moment, I would say.
Hey, I always talk about great leaders. They're grateful leaders. What are you grateful for?
I'm at an age and at a season of life where now I just look at, my wife and my son and the dog, and I'm like, wow, I am so lucky to have these things in my life. And you realize, I mean, it's like, wow, this is just, I mean, regardless of any other material possessions or anything like that, you're like, just these relationships and getting to spend time with these folks is just awesome, because you realize that it's going to be a passing moment. And someday we won't necessarily be together. RJ will be off to school, or wherever. And so we really got to cherish these moments. I'm really grateful for these moments. And then I think the other thing that I would say is I've just been really grateful for the abundance of my life,
Mm.
just in terms of relationships and just in terms of all of the good things I've been able to do recently. I mean, it's just been really, really awesome. And I don't think when I was younger, I ever saw myself ascending to this level. But it's been really amazing to be here right now.
Yeah, that's good stuff, man. I'm grateful for you to be here today, Mike. This has been really, really good. Hey, what energizes you?
So I think the hobbies that I've been working through lately. So I really enjoy cycling.
Mm,
That's always a fun one for me. I don't get to do it as much as I used to, but I still get in spin classes on a weekly basis. So that's always a big one for me. Also, in my downtime, I've really taken up a lot of baking. So that is something I picked up during the pandemic when we were working from home, and it just kind of gave me that tactile, like thing to do, and so I've stayed with it. So that's probably the other thing. I don't know if they
okay.
energize me as much as just sometimes just like cherishing that
Yeah.
downtime and having a little project will just take your mind off of the stuff of the day and just put you in a totally different headspace. And so from that standpoint, I would say those things definitely energize me.
Baking gives you a charge. I love that,
It
Mike
does.
Pierce. Man, man, you're gonna have to bake some cookies or a cake
You
sometime and
know,
bring that up there. I'm excited about this.
I don't share it very often, and that's probably why I do the spin
The
classes, is
whole world
because
knows now,
I sit
Mike.
there and I have to eat it, and then I wind up having to go on the spin class for a couple hours to
I
pay
love it,
for it.
man. So that yeah, that's why you go bike, right? So you can
Exactly. Now
bake
that
and
now that I say it out loud, it's a
it's
cycle. I didn't
fantastic.
realize the cycle I was
I
in.
love it. I love it. Hey, final question. Mike, 10 years older. He's around the corner, he's knocking at your door, and you're going to answer that door. What's he going to say to you?
I think at this point he's just going to tell me to enjoy the ride.
Mm,
I have a pretty hectic life right now, just with a lot of the things that I'm doing and workload and younger family. And I have to constantly remind myself, kind of goes back to the gratitude question, of just kind of taking a beat, slowing down, taking it all in and saying, hey, this is really great. Really fortunate to be in this position, to just be in this moment, of getting to be the Dallas HR leader and having fun at work and doing cool things. And just taking a beat and just appreciating it for a moment. And I think sometimes doing that just helps kind of take some of the stress out of the day and everything else, to just put it all in perspective.
enjoy the ride. I love it. That's a wise 10 years older Mike Pierce. I appreciate you coming onto the show and just sharing perspective and your wisdom for others. I know that there's a lot that you said today that people are going to really resonate with. Hey, if somebody heard something and they want to learn more, maybe they want to learn more about Lockton, maybe they want to learn more about you or Dallas HR. How's the best way for them to connect?
Best way to find me is going to be on LinkedIn.
Okay.
I believe my profile is Mike P. Pierce. You can find me on there. invite you to reach out, connect with me. Happy to be a resource for you at Lockton, through Dallas HR, just in the Dallas market, anything I can do for you.
Fantastic. And be sure and let Mike know you heard him on Life in the Leadership Lane. And it makes that connection so much better when you see that. And so, hey, I appreciate you. I appreciate you coming on today. I appreciate your leadership in Dallas HR, and excited about where the organization's going. And hey, I appreciate your friendship. Thanks again for coming on.
Thank you so much, sir.